You are listening to the Vincast, Australia's premier wine podcast. As a completely free of charge weekly podcast, the Vincast needs your support. But the great news is that it doesn't require any financial support. All you need to do is spread the love. So you can do that via social media, tweet about the podcast, share it on Facebook, even Instagram. You can send me feedback. You can suggest some guests you might like to hear from. But really important is to subscribe to the podcast on any of your podcast hosting apps, particularly iTunes, and give the podcast a 5-star rating and a review, because that really does provide feedback to potential guests and potential listeners who are wine lovers just like you. So thank you to everyone who has got in contact with me and shared their experiences of the podcast. And thanks again to people who have rated and reviewed the podcast on iTunes. And I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. On episode 88 of the Vincast, I chat with Iain Riggs, iconic Hunter Valley winemaker at Brokenwood Wines, and also the most important person behind the Len Evans tutorial. Hello there, Vincasters, and welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and thank you for listening to this week's episode. I hope you have enjoyed recent episodes. I've had some fantastic guests, and I've seen a bit of a spike in the number of downloads and listens to the website of the podcast. I hope you have been enjoying it. And thank you to those who have got in contact with me, because I love hearing from you. I'm particularly interested to know where people are listening to the podcast. Firstly, if you're listening to it through the website, or if you're downloading it and listening to it on an iPhone or an Android device. I'm really interested to know what the location is you listen to it, whether it's on public transport or driving in your car or when you're at work. So please do get in touch with me. You can email me at thevincast@gmail.com, or why not get in contact with me via intrepidwino.com or on social media at intrepidwino on Twitter. Let me know, because I'd love to hear. Now, this week's guest is an iconic winemaker, not just in the Hunter Valley region, but or Australia-wide, really. Iain Riggs, who has worked at Brokenwood Wines, primarily based in the Hunter Valley, but also sourcing fruit from other regions as well. And he's been there for quite a long time and knows the ins and outs of Semillon and Shiraz. And he's also one of the organisers, probably the main organiser of the Len Evans tutorial. So when he was in Melbourne recently, we sat down and had a chat about his background and his views on Australian wine at the moment. And it was really, really interesting. I certainly learnt a lot, and I hope you do too. Stick around to the end of the episode so you can find out how to get in touch with both of us. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. Iain, welcome on the Vincast. Someone I've wanted to have on for a long time, but obviously being based up in the Hunter Valley, distance can be a problem. But finally, I've got you on, so thanks for coming on.
Mate, thank you very much for having me down and doing this cast.
How you've been in Melbourne this week
Yes.
with the trade and,
Yes.
and maybe some media as well. How's the week been?
Been very successful, very happy with it. Came in on Tuesday and went straight into a masterclass with the Australian Sommeliers Association at that fabulous place, Harry and Frankie, down in Port Melbourne. Tom very kindly opened the premises, and we had a good 15-odd people there. Yeah. And part of what we were doing was looking at Beechworth as a region. Even though we're Hunter Valley based, we planted a big vineyard in Beechworth in the late 1990s. And so they've got a bit of age on them, they've got about 17 years. And so we're focusing on Beechworth as a region, not just our wines, everyone's wines.
Well, of course, I had the lovely Tess She was talking about her background, of course. But there's a lot of excitement about the Beechworth region, particularly in Melbourne. And
Good.
I think
good to
wine
hear.
writers are getting really excited as well because there seems to be a lot of energy
Yes.
in that little region. But I usually start every episode of the podcast, as my listeners would know, by asking my guests if they can remember the first interaction that they had with wine that made them think about it in a different way and think about pursuing a career in the wine industry.
Well, that one's easy because it's well documented that in 1970 we were out to dinner. So 1970 I was only 15, but or just turned 16, and had a 1970, so it must have been late 1970 Leo Buring DW 110 Riesling. That prior to that, because we had lived in mid-north of South Australia, went to New South Wales, came back again. Stayed off at the Riverland, where my uncle and auntie both worked in two different wineries, Waikerie Co-op, where I started in 1972, and my auntie worked at Ljubljana at Marook.
Yep.
And back then it really was hock, lime and lemon and mixer drinks and that sort of thing. And this was a table wine which really caught my interest. And
Was it dry or some residual sugar?
that I can't remember. I don't think it was overly sweet. I don't think it was a Spatlays.
Yeah.
May have had some residual sugar, but it really did open my eye.
Yeah.
It was one of those sort of awakening moments. And I suppose it also been staying with my uncle and auntie when we came back from New South Wales and just hearing talk about working in a winery.
Sure.
And so wine, because we had wheat, sheep, and then sheep property, and wine started to enter my consciousness in early 1970.
Wow. Okay. And what were your studies at that time? Like, did you have any particular focus at high school at that point?
No. I was going to be an architect.
Right. Okay.
And I would imagine that it seems to me 50% of winemakers, if they weren't winemaking, they were going to be architects. I don't know why that is.
I know some very, particularly in Italy.
Yes. And so we came back, had 2 years at high school in Adelaide. So that's the only time I had lived in Adelaide. And then went to Roseworthy College. Started there in 1972. And so 1972 was, in fact, my first time in a winery doing vintage. And from 1972, I worked every holidays right through, because Roseworthy, my course back then, I did 2 years ag and 2 years wine, so I was there 4 years. And finished at the end of 75. And worked just every holiday. In fact, I didn't have a holiday for myself during that time. Every holiday was to earn money and work in a winery.
Working was the holiday.
Yes. Yeah.
At the time, were students encouraged to focus on either agriculture or winemaking, or were they expected to sort of learn everything?
No. The 2 years ag was just a way of getting into the wine course, which started every 2 years.
Right. Okay.
And the other thing about my year, I think we were the last of the 2-year courses, or the second last of the 2-year courses. Roseworthy started to change. It went from this very old school, traditional, based on the English style of college, because it was founded in the late 1800s, to a more modern, open campus. And shock horror, we actually had girls on campus for the first time in 1975, I think it was.
Wow.
That was that was different.
So, who were some of the people you were studying with?
So in my year, Geoffrey Grossett was in my year. Alistair Purbrick was in my year.
Former guest.
Kim Rayner, who's now in New Zealand. He was the Rayner family, obviously from McLaren Vale. Tony Devitt from Western Australia was in my year. Andrew Wigan was in my year. Wayne Falkenberg was in my year. So some very, very smart winemakers. They weren't. Some of them had already done degrees, so that was another change. Apart from girls being on campus, we actually had postgrads coming in.
Right.
So these were, to us, these seemed like, wow, these were, particularly Tony Devitt, who was, so 1974, I was approaching 20, and then Tony was like, late 20s. So, but he said, we all fitted in. We all went down the pub and drank and had a great time.
Yeah. And, really some people who
quite seriously changed the face of
Yes,
modern Australian wine.
That's what I was going to lead on to. So some of my year,
Particularly white wine.
Bruce Redman, of course, really had a bit of an impact on the Australian wine scene with the wine styles and the wines they've made. Jeff Grossett, Andrew Wiggin,
of course, particularly Riesling.
Yes.
So where were you working, in your so-called holidays?
Wakery Co-op in 72, 73. And then, and I have no idea except for Bill Potts from the Potts family in Langhorne Creek. Good mates. And I don't know the exact timing, but probably the start of 74 or late 73. I then swapped my holiday work from Wakery down to Langhorne Creek. And the Potts family were happy to have me on board. Jeff Scutchings was the winemaker. He married one of the Potts girls. So there was John Potts, who was the managing director and he had young sons who are now running the business, but they were only quite young back then. And I worked as soon as I finished Roseworthy at the end of 75, straight into winemaking at Bleasdale. Was appointed winemaker of the operation in 78 and went right through to middle of 1980.
Wow, okay. At that point, were you thinking about sort of down the line what you might want to do in the wine industry, or were you just sort of taking it all in and learning and enjoying the work?
Taking it all in. I did know that by 1980 that the industry was moving on, and I associated with a lot of guys, Jeff Merrill and Tim James and all those guys over at McLaren Vale, and the older generation, Colin Kay and Darry Osborne, etc. But knew the industry was changing, the industry was moving on, and that's when I was offered a job as at a startup winery called Hazelmere Estate in McLaren Vale, now known as Serafino. Micro winemaking, and Tony Jordan and Brian Crozer had a consultancy company called Enotech, which still exists in name. Brian sold that to Tony Jordan of Domaine Chandon fame.
My old boss.
And your old boss. There you go. And so I took the job at Hazelmere Estate.
Okay. So what do you think was the really important things were changing the Australian wine industry at that time, and the way that people had to kind of rethink their approaches to wine?
White winemaking, even though we'd had refrigeration, stainless steel tanks, etc., for a couple of decades, white winemaking changed, and Brian Crozer really kicked it off in 1975 with the Hardy's Siegersdorf Riesling, 7.5 grams of residual sugar and fresh as a daisy and really bright, vibrant. And then his work with Charles Sturt and what Wade was doing, Wade Institute, the small-scale winemaking, so picking grapes into milk crates, chilling them in a cold room overnight, clever use of sulphur so that you just didn't throw it all in at the start and then walk away and come back to the press 2 hours later. You added sulphur during the press cycle. And so the wines that we made at Hazelmere, Semillon, Sauvignon Blanc, there was a blend, straight Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay, really made everyone sort of sit up and take notice because they were, and Riesling, really bright, vibrant, and had great fruit expression.
And it's had a pretty profound impact in the market, with people kind of really embracing this new style of white wine.
Yeah, people still, probably incorrectly refer to me as the founder of Sauvignon Blanc Semillon blend, because it was 2/3 Sauvignon Blanc, 1/3 Semillon, and sometimes vice versa, but generally less Semillon. Short time in oak and bottled. Certainly Tim Napstein and the Cullens were making a Fumé style in the 70s, but this really upfront fruit style we did start at Hazelmere. Then we became quite famous for the Hazelmere 82 Chardonnay, which got me the Bushing King award. It was the only white to win the Bushing King at the McLaren Vale Wine Show since.
You're going to have to explain the Bushing King.
Okay, the Bushing King is the it comes out of the McLaren Vale Wine Show, and it's for the champion wine of that wine show, that year's wine show.
So it's sort of a little bit like the Jimmy Watson, except that's just for red.
Well, it can be an older wine.
It's sort of the most prestigious award.
Yes,
yeah,
it is. And the Bushing Festival in McLaren Vale is, they have the robes, not too dissimilar to the Barossa. And
the Barons.
You are the Bushing King for that year. And there were no rules.
Do you have to wear the robes for the full year?
No, thankfully I didn't. And that one then went on to win a trophy in Adelaide, and then a trophy in Canberra, and then it was sold out. So that made people sit up and take notice.
Certainly, if it was the first white wine.
My word.
So, and again, how was the market changing? Were people thinking more about, having wine with food? Was that concept kind of starting to kick in a little bit?
I think wine consumption was certainly going up.
Sure.
The late 70s, for whatever reason, became a year of the winemaker dictating everything that was done. So we had some pretty weird wines come. Looking back, they were quite weird. Wines coming through in those late 70s, early 80s. Red wines were sometimes 10.5% alcohol, 11% alcohol. Coonawarra was made with machine pruning and machine harvesting, and the 1980 St George Cabernet was that really leafy, super herbaceous style of Cabernet, which everyone quickly loved and then everyone quickly hated. And by 82, and then certainly by 84, everyone realised that, look, this is wrong. Winemakers don't dictate what happens in the vineyard. That's why we're viticulturists. And so the wines started to move up a bit in alcohol and get back to full ripeness and balance in the vineyard. And certainly by 84 and then by 86, we had some really memorable red wines coming out of Australia. Then, of course, much later into the 90s, we had the parkerisation of Australian wine. So we went from what was in 1980 some wines at 10.5% alcohol to wines at 16% alcohol. So we had a pretty wild ride through the 80s and 90s.
In those earlier days, did you have the opportunity to travel around much? Were you visiting other wine regions and kind of going to learn and see, tricks of the trade?
Within Australia, the best place to learn and see wines was wine shows.
Yeah, okay.
Wine shows really govern change in the way the winemakers thought about wine.
Yeah.
And
so did you get involved as far as judging?
Yes, I started, certainly in the late 70s in Adelaide, I was doing wine magazine reviews, and then went to Brokenwood, as I said, at the end of 82, and I was judging associate judge in Canberra at the end of 83.
So you've been at Brokenwood since then?
Yep, just finished my 34th vintage.
That's quite incredible.
And 45th all up.
Tell me a little bit about Brokenwood. When was it originally established?
The first 4.5 hectare property was bought in October 1970.
Yep.
And James Halliday, John Beeston and Tony Albert, 3 solicitors. Tony went on to the bar. Bought the property. Expected to pay $300 an acre for it, ended up paying close to $1,000 because they didn't count on the neighbouring property also wanting that 10-acre block, because there's not too many small blocks in the Brokenwood region. It was covered in forest, so they set about clearing it. We've got the Broken Back Range as our backstop, clearing all the trees. The name Brokenwood came about. Planted it through early 1971 and picked the first grapes in 73. So the first vintage was then relied on friends and family to provide all the labour, including winemaking, including pruning, harvesting, planting, the whole lot. Had enough friends that they could then expand the shareholding in 1978 to buy the Graveyard Vineyard from Hungerford Hill. That was a 15-hectare block, planted with a bit of Cabernet Merlot. I think it might have had one small block of Chardonnay on it, or they planted Chardonnay. Possibly
a little bit more than $1,000 an acre?
Yes. And then, no, actually, that's a good point. I don't know what they paid for that. But it's interesting how the Hunter Valley cycle changed so dramatically that people were clamouring for land in 1970, and yet it was Hungerford Hill that sold that block of land. That they were selling off land.
Yeah.
8 years later.
Interesting.
That's the cycle of Hunter Valley changed quite dramatically. And then I think they were getting older and they were doing other things, the partnership that is.
Sure.
Getting sick of doing it themselves and they had plans to expand Brokenwood because they had a really good name in the Sydney market and needed an employee.
Right.
So I was the first employee. So at the same time as Hazelmere Estate, so I made that 82 Chardonnay. Hazelmere, the owners of Hazelmere Estate was, that company was imploding. Brokenwood was looking for a winemaker. So Tony Jordan, Brian Crozer were involved, and I made the sort of transition from McLaren Vale to the Hunter Valley.
How was that?
It was good. Yes, I'd lived in New South Wales, up in the Tablelands, in the late 60s, so I knew, the area.
Sure.
But Hunter Valley was pretty traditional. There was, I don't know how many companies, maybe a dozen companies. There's now 70 odd in the region, so it was quite small.
Yeah.
And we implemented the same system of winemaking that we used at Hazelmere. So I had to put in a cold room, picking into milk crates. Everyone thought we were mad, and the 1983 Brokenwood Semillon was so dramatically different to what anyone had seen before. Some loved it, the marketplace loved it. Traditional winemakers weren't so sure. Murray Tyrrell was very vocal about it.
Mm. And when you say traditional, are these the kind of people who were probably influenced by people like Maurice O'Shea?
No, they just made one style of Semillon, which was generally low fruit to start with, but did build flavour as it aged.
Yeah, okay.
As none of the
picking it
young
early
Semillons never really made a big impact in the marketplace.
Right. Okay. And so you got involved with wine shows.
Yes. Yeah.
How did you get into the wine show?
Oh, well, Len Evans was my mentor, as was Halliday, and they were both heavily involved in the Canberra wine show. So
did you meet them when you went over to start working at Brokenwood?
Halliday, I met Halliday for the first time in mid-82. I had already met Len in McLaren Vale in the late 70s, so he already knew of me. And Len was in the process of building his house in the Hunter Valley and moving lock, stock and barrel by about 86. And so we became great mates and played golf and formed the Hunter Valley Options Group, which is still going 27 years later. And
for those who may not be familiar with the concept of options, could you just quickly explain how options works?
Yeah, it's a competitive game.
Sure.
And Len formalised it, and so the Bulletin Place Front Row, which was Len's restaurant in Sydney, a Bulletin Place, every Monday they played options, and it was then they fine-tuned the questions, 5 questions, and a maximum of 3 options within each one. To keep count of your score, you lost 20 cents. So if you got one wrong, so you might start with 20 coins and what you've got left. So that's you can work out who the winner is. And so there were quite strict rules around it, and these evolved over the years. And then when you moved to the Hunter, we formed the Hunter Options Group, and we've been playing it once a month ever since 1987.
And how did Len get involved with wine show judging?
Well, he is the doyen of wine show judging. He's the godfather. John Fairbrother was Len's mentor, and he was a great judge through the 40s and 50s, and Len got into wine in the 1960s and really put wine as something to enjoy with food and as an everyday part of life. Became what his champion cause was.
So when you came to Brokenwood, the idea was for you to completely manage everything, both viticulture and winemaking.
Yep.
So what changes, if any, did you make in terms of the vineyard work?
We started when the 1970s in the decade in the Hunter was a very, very wet one.
Right.
And the agronomists and the guys who work for the Department of Agriculture insisted that the only way to plant a vineyard was on contours because we had huge summer storms. But the only reason we needed to do that was they thought the only way to run a vineyard was to put a plough through it every second day.
Okay.
So we've got these photos of the graveyard vineyard from the 70s, and it looks like the Sahara Desert. There is not a blade of grass to be seen anywhere.
Yeah.
So you manage vineyards like that, of course, you're going to get huge erosion and runoffs.
Mm.
So the Department of Ag guys were saying, oh, no, you've got to plant on contours and have all these big contour banks and collect all that and then return it back to the vineyard. Almost immediately within the 80s, we started changing that way of thinking and leaving grass up and down the rows, which makes sense because you could actually go and pick grapes if it had rained and you had a grass swath through the middle.
So that was a sort of a strange concept at the time?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So then as we started to replant the graveyard, we started to take out the contour banks and make longer rows, and they weren't curved, and put them in straight rows, and not cultivate as often as we were doing. So small changes like that, small changes for pruning. It's our two vineyards were on clay, really low yield, low fertility. So the vines were pretty well self managed. You couldn't leave too much fruit on. You had every spray regime correct because we do get summer rains.
Sure.
And that sort of thing.
Many apologies for interrupting this fascinating chat with Iain, but you might have heard him mention James Halliday. If you didn't know who James Halliday was, apart from establishing a number of wineries in different regions in Australia, he's also one of the most important wine educators and wine communicators in Australian wine history. And he established Wine Companion, which was an annual guide to Australian wines, which evolved into a regular wine publication and also a fantastic resource online, which has information about wineries, vintages, and reviews and scores of thousands and thousands of wines. So as a special treat for supporters of this podcast, the guys at Wine Companion and their new magazine Halliday, they're offering you a 30% discount on any subscription package when you put in the special code Intrepid30. So please do go to winecompanion.com.au, have a look at some of the subscription packages, and let them know that you heard about it through the Vincast podcast. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.
So what was the split at the time between sort of red and white wine?
When I started, it was 100% red.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, at Brokenwood. And that really was against the consumption pattern.
Right.
The Australian consumption pattern started to change in 1975 from 70 red, or 100% red almost, and whites really started to make a big impact through into consumers' minds and purchasing ideas. But Brokenwood was out of kilter. So my starting at Brokenwood was really to drive the white wine production.
So were you grafting, or were you planting new vineyards?
No, there were white vineyards available to go and get contract growers.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so we just bought in white grapes.
And that was sort of when you took that approach that you sort of been well established for down in the McLaren Vale with the way you were making the whites and so that, and that made a pretty immediate impact.
Yep, absolutely, yes. The idea for Brokenwood back then was to make a wooded Chardonnay and a wooded Semillon. I don't know why everyone thought, but that's what it was. And in 1983, we had 2 tanks of Semillon, and we looked at it and decided that was too good to go into oak and was really worth bottling as a standalone wine. We bottled that. That was 700 cases, and then put it into the Sydney marketplace, and within 6 months we bottled the other 700 cases, the other tank, and there was only a tiny amount left to go to oak. And we persisted with the oak Semillon, and it was a small quantity, and 89 was the last vintage of that. And the production of Semillon, the unoaked Semillon, went from that initial 700 cases. Now our standard production is somewhere around the 10 to 12,000 cases.
Mm. And so did you have the opportunity to be sort of the ambassador for Brokenwood?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I was in the marketplace once a week, twice a week.
How did you find, because today I find that there's still, certainly in Melbourne, there's a little bit of resistance against
not in
Hunter
Sydney.
wines.
Sydney's, the only reason the Hunter exists as a wine region is because Sydney's on the doorstep.
Yeah.
Yeah, no question.
And was it mostly being sold into, hotels, restaurants, or were you selling a lot into? Was there much of a retail market for wine at that point?
There were a lot of independents. This was before
Sure.
the big buy-up of the chains.
Yeah.
But we had a huge success on premise.
Right.
Yeah, very much so. Sydney in summer is a real outdoor seafood. And I remember calling on a young chef by the name of Neil Perry, and he had Blue Water Grill in Bondi.
Yeah.
And putting Semillon, our young Semillon, on the menu there.
So that was an important thing to be doing, is establishing that kind of relationship with, restaurant chefs.
Yep, absolutely. Yes.
Sommeliers the sommelier wasn't quite a thing yet.
There were mainly chef operators,
Right,
or owners, and they were front of house. So the sommelier didn't have quite the power of make or break they do now, perhaps.
yeah. And how was the Hunter kind of evolving? In the sort of throughout the 80s and then into the 90s.
Yeah, red wine was still the major part, even though Semillon was a big production. But the rise of Chardonnay was probably the major thing.
Yeah.
The Hunter went from being a Semillon and Shiraz region to being Chardonnay.
So it was,
Shiraz
and that was
Semillon.
reflective of just Australia wide.
Yep.
Just
Yep.
everyone was planting Chardonnay.
You had the Rosemount factor.
Sure.
So Rosemount was in the Upper Hunter, and that day that the Premier of New South Wales said he was going to go home and have a glass of Rosemount Chardonnay, that was it. Sales just went ballistic.
Oh.
Mm.
How did Brokenwood evolve, sort of moving into the 90s?
Well, we had another stroke of good fortune in that come 1990, the growers that I used to take the fruit from in McLaren Vale when I worked at Hazelmere Estate rang me and said, we've got this fruit available, Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon.
Mm.
And the Sauvignon Blanc clone was an old clone and had a really good herbaceous character. So I said, let's have a crack at it, because we could only make so much Semillon and sell it as Semillon into the marketplace. And then started making Sauvignon Blanc Semillon.
Mm.
Again, first bottling was 700 cases in 1990, and it was just called Sauvignon Blanc Semillon. And we always label where the fruit was from.
So this is McLaren Vale fruit?
Yes.
Oh.
And that production then grew to a peak of 36,000 cases, I think.
Okay.
So, and then that has declined, obviously, with the Savalanche, the impact of Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand. But again, we owned the marketplace and the on-premise with that Sauvignon Blanc Semillon in Sydney.
And do you continue to make wine from McLaren Vale fruit?
Yep. Brokenwood's taken fruit from other regions since 1978.
Mm-hmm.
Australian wine industry's made blends. Region winemakers have blended regions, going back to the 1930s, 40s, and 1950s.
Sure.
So we recognise that the Hunter has a particular climate and particular style of wine that it makes. So Chardonnay, Semillon, Shiraz. There are some other varieties. People make very good Cabernet, Sangiovese. Nowadays, Mourvedre, Barbera. But if we wanted to make a great Pinot or a great Chardonnay or a great Cabernet, we had to go outside the region, which we did do. We've also developed our own vineyard with a sister syndicate at Beechworth, and that supplies us with about 200 tonne of really top-notch fruit across a big spectrum: Pinot, Cabernet, Shiraz, Chardonnay, but also Tempranillo, Sangiovese, Nebbiolo, Pinot Gris, and that's a really important region for us, the Beechworth. McLaren Vale, still important, and Orange is the other premium cool climate region that we source fruit from.
Is the Beechworth estate the only other one that's owned by Brokenwood?
Well, it's a sister syndicate, and there's a couple of common shareholders.
Right, okay.
But yes, the rest are contract growers.
Mm-hmm. So was the Beechworth vineyard planted or was it purchased?
The land was purchased. We went in search of a premium region and purchased by a sister syndicate, a syndicate put together.
Sure.
And we consulted on all the plantings and how it should be run. And away we went.
What was it that brought you to the Beechworth region?
Soil, climate, water, and Gioconda was up the road.
Sure.
And we'd drunk a lot of Gioconda.
And what were the initial decisions about planting there?
Well, we knew we had to have Chardonnay.
Sure.
We thought the site was a bit different to Gioconda because I think, and Rick will probably admit this, that Pinot and Cabernet is okay in that region, but I think other varieties are better. So, but we did put Pinot when we put Cabernet in, put Shiraz in, and the Chardonnay, Shiraz, Pinot Gris, they're just killing it down there. And we're now getting better clones of Nebbiolo, of Sangiovese, of Tempranillo top grafting. We had Viognier in there in the early years. The best thing we did was put a bulldozer through that. And Cabernet and I think there's a little bit of Roussanne there that the syndicate wanted, still growing.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing was we had to plant what clones we had available to us. This was 17 years ago.
Sure. And
we're now getting better clones. So
particularly in terms of the alternative varieties.
Yes, yeah. So the first Sangiovese, and we've still got it, is the Carlo Cruno clone from Mudgee, from Montrose, and now we've got a Brunello clone, which is just terrific. We've got a better Nebbiolo clone. We've got better Pinot Gris clones. So it's really charging for us.
So I can imagine, particularly this time of year during the vintage, you would do a bit of travelling, particularly if you're looking at fruit from other regions.
Yes, yeah. Luckily, I've got two cracker winemakers at the moment. Stu Horton is our senior winemaker, and Kate Sturgis, assistant winemaker. Stu took over from Simon Steele, who most people would know from Shadowfax days, and he's now ensconced at Medhurst in the Yarra, and making some cracking wine.
Yeah.
Well, Matt Harris himself. Matt was our winemaker in 74, 76, 74. I'm getting my dates all confused. 94, 95, 96.
And tell me, Len Evans tutorial.
Yep.
How did that get established?
Len wanted to establish a wine school that would really focus on style as opposed to technical quality. Australian wines and the Australian wine industry has benefited hugely from the wine show system, particularly through the 70s and 80s, in ridding wines of just common faults.
Right.
Whether it be as basic as Macapton, as more complex as Brettanomyces, volatile acidity, etc. That was a very technical sense. There were some style judges. Len himself was a style judge. He drank widely from Europe and all over the world, as was Halliday. But for the most part, the senior wine show judges were winemakers. So Len wanted to broaden the spectrum of judges available, and the best way to do it was to start a wine school. So he rang 12 of wine remates and said, right, I need $7,000 from you. This is what we're going to do. No one said no. And it's held in the Hunter every November. This year's coming up. We're just about to advertise for applicants for this year, which will be our 16th year of the Tute. So 12 lucky scholars go up and spend a week immersed in wine, seeing some of the greatest wines, from the world. We've got such great sponsorship as from DRC. Aubert de Villaine sells us 14 bottles. We don't get the Chardonnay, we get all the reds. So now, from 09, the 7 red vineyards, and 2 bottles of each at cost price. So that's enormous benefit.
That's very generous.
And we've got some great sponsors, so we're able to source some great wines. And I think we have been responsible in getting style judges and even the winemaker judges that are so prominent in the wine show judging system. And I think of Sam Connew and Tom Carson, Dave Bicknell, PJ Charteris, Jim Chatto. They're into the system, but there's some great sommelier judges as well. You know, Dan Sims, Philip Rich, Tom from
Tom Hogan,
Harry and Frankie,
Adam Cottrell.
Yeah, everyone. You know, they're making a big impact, and it's good. It's good.
So, Len actually started it sort of informally.
No, it was very. You know, it was all set up quite structured.
Okay.
We had master classes. On Prestige Champagne, on Riesling, on Bordeaux, on Rhone varieties. The judging is 30 wines served blind. We do Rhone varieties, Bordeaux varieties, Chardonnay and Pinot. And, just talk about the wines. And they judge blind. We talk about the wines. And then out of that, we have a system of measuring how far off our score the scholars are. And then by the end of the week, we can arrive at a Dux, and the Dux gets a return business trip to Europe.
So the idea is to essentially train wine show judges, or just judges in general?
Well, judges in general. We found those first 6-7 years we put some terrific judges into the system. So we kind of backed off that a little bit, more focusing on training or giving great training to sommeliers, to wine writers, to retailers, to restaurant owners.
Yeah.
Anyone we thought would make an impact in conveying what the message of quality wine through to consumers.
Sure.
And other winemakers and other journalists, etc. So that was very successful. We've kind of swung back to making sure that our 12, we have a good number of winemakers in the 12.
Yeah.
Because the reality is that the wine industry and winemakers still form the bulk of the wine show judging panels. And, people complain. I'm not sort of saying wine judging is the only way to judge quality. But, to have the people available to take a week out of your work schedule here and there. So we've got some terrific people coming through.
And rather than just sort of looking at wine from a technical perspective and just to sort of make sure that it's varietally correct and that kind of thing, it's talking more about what is an ideal example. Are we looking at? I'm assuming when you look at different grape varieties, you're looking at examples from what are considered to be the best parts of the world.
Yeah, and Len started this when he would host his chairman's dinners. He would always have great examples, and not just wines from overseas, but examples of great Australian wines from the 40s and 50s and 60s, as to try and get the young judges to think outside the square. Mm-hmm. So this is a great Bordeaux, or this is a great example of Burgundy, this is DRC. How do we see that in the wines that we see in the wine show? Does it mean, and when you find that great one and it gets promoted and goes through and maybe gets trophies, you then trace back where it's grown and what was the winemaking technique? What did that person do different that made it such a distinctive wine? And, I think the combination of the judges thinking outside the square, we've seen some really interesting wines, come through.
And is there a component of kind of improving how that's communicated and how you actually talk about sort of wine quality and style?
I think so. Yeah. From my time in judging, the I won't say old school judges, but the way the judging worked was there were judges.
Sure. Then
there were associates. Quite often the associates had to do all the pouring as well as judging.
Yeah. Associates
were to be seen and not heard. Mm-hmm. The judges were correct, and thanks for your time. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, you've got, say you've got 3 judges and maybe 2 associates, but sometimes even 3 associates. Everyone's score gets looked at. Everyone has a voice. End of the day, the panel chair's got to make a decision. but you've got 6 people giving input into these wines.
Mm.
So it's got to be better. The wines we cut down the number of wines we judge per day. Like when I first started, wasn't unheard of to do 200 to 230 wines a day.
Mm.
But you could also say back then there was good wines and there were lots of bad ones. So it was pretty easy to sort out the good ones and bad ones. Now we're down to 120 wines, and
they're all
every wine gets looked at really thoroughly.
Yeah. So for people who are kind of interested in, I guess, finding out how a wine show works and how wine show judging works, obviously there are lots and lots of different wine shows from the capitals into the regions.
Yes.
How would you actually suggest someone just try and kind of get involved?
Right to the committee.
Yeah.
And
like you're applying for a job?
Yeah, then it's kind of helpful if you know someone who's judging the wine show. And like Victoria's got a lot of wine shows, Ballarat, Yarra, the Victorian wine show itself. Now it's got the Chardonnay Challenge, etc. And of course, culminating in Royal Melbourne. So if you know someone, that's a big plus. And then just write off an application CV saying, if I can't, so you've never done any judging. So I'm happy to be a steward.
Yeah, of course.
Happy to just go for free, pour wine. All wine shows need back of house.
Yeah.
And quite often, I know certainly at Sydney, when I was there at Sydney Wine Show for 25 years, that one day an associate might be sick or something, and we'd put a steward in for training purposes, and they get exposure that way.
And if people would like to find out more about the Len Evans tutorial for this year,
go to the website. It's on the website, www.lenevanstutorial.com.au.
Fantastic. Iain, I really do appreciate you making some time whilst you're here in Melbourne.
Absolute pleasure.
Would you like to let the listeners know ways that they could find out more about Brokenwood and also, follow yourself on social media?
Yes, yeah, indeed. I mean, Brokenwood's just launched its revamped website, so you can, if you're interested in any of our wines, it's an online shop as well.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of detail there on history. If your listeners were questioning something I said, then it's probably in our history page on on our website, bios of all of us. As I say, an online shop. Brokenwood's on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I'm personally on Twitter, RiggsBW, Instagram as Iain Riggs, and Facebook as well. So, we fully embrace social media. We love talking about wine. People probably get sick of us talking about wine, but it's a great industry to be in, and thank you very much for having me.
Well, hopefully they don't get too sick, otherwise this podcast would cease to be.
Yes, true.
Great stuff. And people can visit Brokenwood in Hunter Valley as well?
Indeed, yep. Great cellar door there, and wines from all over. But, look for the wines in retail down here. We are getting more and more traction in the on-premise as well. So
certainly for all of the listeners in Sydney, you should have no problems finding Brokenwood.
No, Brokenwood's everywhere in Sydney.
Fantastic. Thanks again.
Absolute pleasure.
As always, guys, thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. And of course, thank you to Iain for being on the show. You can follow me on social media on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at Intrepid Wino, and you can also follow the podcast on Twitter at the Vincast. Facebook.com/Intrepid Wino is where you'll find my Facebook page, so please hit that like button, and that way you can see all the things that I share on there. I'd love for you to come and visit me on the Intrepid Wino channel on YouTube, and you can see some of my Let's Taste wine tasting videos where I share my impressions of different Australian wines. And of course, I really would love for you to subscribe to the podcast on any different podcast sharing app. Give the podcast a rating and a review, and share your experiences of the podcast. You can find all that information at intrepidwino.com, as well as lots of different writings that I've done in the past. I look forward to having you on future episodes of the podcast. I've got some great guests coming up, but until then, bye.